20 and I married my sister, but she cheated on me and we divorced. Later we got married again, but now I'm not raising my children. We got married in our early 20s, full of dreams and love, believing we could conquer anything together. Sarah and I met during our sophomore year in college, both of us young and vibrant, drawn together by an electric connection that felt like destiny. She was studying art, always painting, her fingers perpetually smudged with colors, while I was knee-deep in engineering textbooks. Our worlds were different, but we found a way to blend them, creating a symphony of contrasting elements. Our wedding was a modest affair, attended by close family and friends. We didn't have much money, but we had each other, and that seemed enough. Those first few years were a whirlwind of happiness and excitement. We rented a small apartment downtown, close to her studio and my office. Weekends were for adventures, exploring the city, visiting art galleries, and hiking trails in nearby parks. Sarah's laughter was a constant melody in our home, her creativity spilling into every corner, making even mundane days feel special. But life has a way of testing the strongest bonds. It started subtly, a disagreement here, a misunderstanding there. Our financial situation, which once seemed manageable, began to tighten its grip on us. My job at the tech company was demanding, often requiring late nights and weekends. Sarah's freelance art gigs were inconsistent, leaving us in a constant state of financial uncertainty. The pressure was mounting, and we were both feeling it. Then came the illness. It was a cold, harsh winter when Sarah fell sick. At first, we thought it was just the flu, but her condition worsened. She was diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder, something that would require long-term treatment and management. The medical bills started piling up, and my job barely covered our basic needs. The stress of it all began to erode the foundation of our relationship. Sarah's illness meant she couldn't work as much, and she grew frustrated with her limitations. I tried to be supportive, but the burden of being the sole breadwinner weighed heavily on. Our once joyous home became a battleground of silent resentments and unspoken fears. We argued more frequently, often about money, but also about the things we never thought would come between us. I was tired and stressed from work, while Sarah felt isolated and helpless. The tension seeped into every aspect of our lives. Simple conversations turned into heated debates, and we both said things we didn't mean. There were nights when I stayed at the office longer than necessary, just to avoid going home to another fight. Sarah withdrew into her art, using it as an escape, but even that wasn't enough to shield her from the reality of our crumbling marriage. I began experiencing panic attacks, something I had never dealt with. The constant pressure was breaking me down, mentally and physically. I felt trapped in a cycle of anxiety and despair, unable to see a way out. Sarah noticed, of course, but by then we were too disconnected to offer each other the support we both desperately needed. In the midst of this chaos, we made the difficult decision to separate. It wasn't a sudden choice, but rather a slow, painful realization that we were no longer good for each other. Our love had turned into something toxic, and staying together was only making things worse. We both needed space to heal and to rediscover who we were outside of the turmoil that had become our life. The divorce was amicable, a bittersweet ending to what had once been a beautiful love story. We divided our belongings, signed the papers, and went our separate ways. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, while Sarah stayed in our old place, surrounded by the memories of what used to be. In the quiet of my new home, I had time to reflect on everything that had happened. The initial relief of being away from the constant conflict gave way to a deep sadness. I missed Sarah, missed the life we had built together, even though it had ended in ruins. The mental health issues I developed during our marriage didn't disappear overnight. I sought therapy, trying to unravel the knots of anxiety and depression that had taken hold of me. Sarah and I remained in touch, our interactions cordial but distant. We both needed time to heal, to find ourselves again. I threw myself into work, using it as a distraction while Sarah continued her art, eventually finding a new rhythm in her life. It took years, but slowly, we both began to rebuild. After the divorce, Sarah and I tried to maintain some semblance of a relationship. We were civil to each other, exchanging occasional texts and phone calls during holidays, birthdays, or anniversaries of significant moments in our past. At first, these interactions felt like a lifeline, a way to cling to the good memories while trying to forget the bad ones. But inevitably, every conversation would spiral into a confrontation. It was like walking through a minefield. We'd start off with pleasantries, perhaps reminiscing about a shared experience or updating each other on our lives. But the underlying tension always found a way to surface. Sarah would bring up how I had failed to support her during her illness, and I would counter with how her behavior had driven me to the brink of a breakdown. The unresolved bitterness lingered like a specter, haunting every attempt at reconciliation. One Christmas, I remember calling her to wish her well. She sounded happy at first, telling me about a new art project she was working on and how she had started teaching painting classes at a community center. I was genuinely glad to hear she was doing better, but then the conversation took a familiar turn. She mentioned how hard it had been to pay the medical bills on her own after I left, and I felt my temper rising. We rehashed old arguments, each of us trying to justify our actions, neither willing to let go of the past. Birthdays were no different. A simple happy birthday message would somehow evolve into a heated debate about who had hurt whom more. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, and it felt like we were trapped in an endless loop of blame and regret. Each argument chipped away at the fragile truce we had managed to build, leaving us both more wounded than before. After 3 years of this emotional roller coaster, I couldn't take it. I was trying to move forward with my life, to find some measure of peace, but our interactions kept dragging me back into the dark place I had worked so hard to escape. It was clear that we were only reopening old wounds, making it impossible for either of us to heal. One night, after another argument that left me feeling hollow and defeated, I decided to write Sarah a letter. I spent hours drafting and redrafting, trying to find the right words to convey my thoughts without causing more pain. In the end, I realized there was no way to sugarcoat the truth. I poured my heart into that letter. I acknowledged my mistakes, admitting that I had failed her in many ways. I confessed that I had been overwhelmed by the pressures of our life, that I hadn't known how to cope with her illness or the financial strain. But I also laid bare my grievances, telling her how her actions had made me feel isolated and unappreciated. I told her about the mental health issues I had struggled, how the constant fighting had driven me to the edge. I expressed my sorrow for how things had turned out, but I also told her that I couldn't keep doing this. The arguments, the bitterness, the endless cycle of blame, it wasn't healthy for either of us. I needed to let go, to move on, and I believed she needed the same. I ended the letter by saying that for my own well-being, I couldn't continue to have contact. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever written, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I sent the letter and waited, half expecting a furious response, but none came. Days turned into weeks, then months, and there was only silence. It was a strange, hollow feeling, like a part of me had been cut away. But gradually, I began to feel a sense of relief. The constant anxiety, the dread of our next confrontation began to fade. I focused on my therapy, my work, and rebuilding my life. Years passed, and the sharp edges of our past slowly softened. I heard through mutual friends that Sarah was doing well. She had become a respected artist in our community, her classes popular, and her work featured in several local galleries. It made me happy to know she had found her path, just as I was finding mine. Sometimes, late at night, I would think about the life we had shared, the dreams we had once believed in. I would remember the laughter, the adventures, and even the fights, with a kind of bittersweet nostalgia. Our story hadn't ended the way we had hoped, but it was a part of me, a chapter that had shaped who I was. One day, as I was cleaning out my apartment, I found an old sketchbook of Sarah's tucked away in a drawer. Flipping through the pages, I saw the drawings she had made during our happiest times. There were sketches of our apartment, of me working at my desk, of us on one of our hikes. It brought a tear to my eye, and I realized that despite everything, I didn't regret our time together. We had loved deep, and though it hadn't lasted, it had been real. Then, one evening, out of the blue, I received a message on Facebook. It was from Sarah. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it. She had reached out about a mutual friend who was going through a tough time and had mentioned both of us in conversation. The message was friendly, devoid of any of the old tension, and purely concerned with the well-being of our friend. We exchanged a few messages, initially just catching up on what had happened in our lives since we last spoke. It was cautious at first, each of us feeling out the other, seeing if the old wounds had truly healed. But the more we talked, the easier it became. We laughed about old memories, shared updates on our careers and personal lives, and even discussed the mutual friend in more detail. After a few weeks of chatting online, Sarah suggested meeting up for a drink. I was hesitant at first, worried that seeing her in person might stir up old emotions, but curiosity and a genuine desire to see how she was doing won out. We agreed to meet at a cozy little bar downtown, one that hadn't been part of our old routine, a neutral ground. Seeing her again after all those years was surreal. She looked much the same, yet different in ways that only time can explain. There was a calmness about, a maturity that mirrored my own. We greeted each other with a hug, and it felt surprisingly natural, as if no time had passed at all. The evening went well, better than I had expected. We talked for hours, catching up on everything and nothing. There was a sense of ease between us, a stark contrast to the tension that had defined our interactions post-divorce. It felt good, like reconnecting with an old friend who had been missed but not forgotten. As the weeks went by, we continued to meet up. Sometimes it was for a drink, other times for a walk in the park or a casual dinner. We kept things light and easy, both of us wary of falling back into old patterns. But as we spent more time together, it became clear that something had shifted. We were no longer the same people who had hurt each other so deeply. We had grown, matured, and the emotional baggage that had weighed us down seemed lighter now. One evening, over dinner, we began talking about the past. It wasn't a planned conversation, but rather something that flowed naturally from where we were. We spoke about the pain, the arguments, the things that had driven us apart. But instead of anger or blame, there was understanding and empathy. We could see now how our younger selves had been ill-equipped to handle the challenges we faced. We had both made mistakes, but we had also both learned from them. Sarah told me how the divorce had forced her to confront her own issues, how therapy and time had helped her grow stronger and more independent. I shared my own journey, the struggles with anxiety and depression, and how finding peace within myself had been a hard but necessary road. There were moments of sadness in our conversation, but also moments of clarity and even joy. We were two people who had been through a lot, but who had come out the other side stronger. As we continued to spend time together, it became clear that the spark between us had never truly died. It had just been buried under layers of hurt and misunderstanding. With those layers stripped away, we found a connection that was deeper and more genuine than before. We decided to give our relationship another try, cautiously and with open hearts. Dating Sarah again was a completely different experience. We were more patient with each other, more understanding of our flaws and limitations. We communicated better, having learned the hard way the importance of honesty and openness. There were still challenges, of course. No relationship is without them, but we faced them as partners, not adversaries. Over time, our relationship grew stronger. We rebuilt the trust that had been broken, not by ignoring the past, but by acknowledging it and learning. We made new memories, creating a life together that was both familiar and refreshingly new. We supported each other's dreams, celebrated each other's successes, and comforted each other in times of need. One evening, a year into our renewed relationship, Sarah suggested we take a holiday together. It was something we had often talked about, but never managed to do when we were married the first time. We decided on a trip to Scotland, a place neither of us had visited, but both of us were curious about. The idea of exploring new landscapes and making new memories was too appealing to pass up. Our trip was magical from the start. We rented a small cottage near the Highlands, surrounded by breathtaking scenery and far removed from the bustle of our everyday lives. We hiked through rugged landscapes, wandered through quaint villages, and spent our evenings by the fireplace, sharing stories and dreams for the future. On the third day of our trip, while strolling through the picturesque village of Gretna Green, Sarah paused outside a small, charming chapel. She turned to me with a smile and said, "What if we got married again? Right here, right now." I was taken aback for a moment, but then a wave of excitement and joy washed over. It felt right, like the perfect culmination of our journey back to each other. We found 2 shopkeepers willing to be our witnesses, and in the simplest ceremony imaginable, we exchanged vows once more. Standing there in that tiny chapel, with just Sarah and the 2 kind strangers, I felt a deep sense of peace and happiness. It wasn't about the pomp or the spectacle. It was about the love that had endured and grown stronger through everything we had faced. Our secret wedding felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by simplicity and intentional living. When we returned home, we decided to make some significant changes. Inspired by the serene beauty of the Scottish countryside and the joy we found in each other's company, we committed to a more self-sustainable lifestyle. We moved to a modest house with a large garden where we started our own allotments. Growing our own vegetables and keeping chickens became a part of our daily routine. We adopted 2 dogs from a local shelter, filling our home with even more love and laughter. The busy, material-driven lives we once led seemed distant and unimportant. We found joy in the simple things: morning coffee on the porch, tending to our garden, and long walks with our dogs. Financially, things were tighter than they had ever been. I decided to return to school as a mature student, pursuing a degree in environmental science, something I had always been passionate about, but never had the chance to explore. Sarah found various part-time jobs within her field, from teaching art classes to working on commissioned pieces. We made enough to get by, but more importantly, we were happy. The less money we had, the more content we became. Our focus shifted from earning and spending to living and enjoying. We learned to appreciate the value of time over money, choosing to work less so we could spend more time together. Weekends were for leisurely breakfasts, working in our garden, and exploring the nearby countryside. We found pleasure in the rhythms of our daily life, in the routine tasks that brought us closer together. 7 years have passed since our impromptu wedding in Gretna Green, and our lives have only become richer in meaning and contentment. Our home is filled with the warmth of love and the satisfaction of a life well lived. We have grown even closer, our bond strengthened by the trials we faced and the joy we found in simplicity.